The candles were still burning in the grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor. The last carriage had just rolled away into the cold October night. The wedding guests were gone. The music had stopped. And Clara Whitfield, no, Clara Blackwood now, stood alone at the bottom of the marble staircase, still wearing her white wedding gown. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. The Duke of Blackwood came down the stairs slowly, and in his hands he carried something no bride should ever see on her wedding night: a wooden bucket and a scrubbing brush. He dropped them at her feet. The bucket hit the marble floor with a crash that echoed through the empty hall, and dirty water splashed across the hem of her wedding dress. "You will learn what you are in this house," he said coldly. "I want this ballroom floor shining by morning, and you will do it in that dress, so you never forget the day you dared to become a duchess." Clara looked down at the brush. Then she looked up at the man she had married only 12 hours ago, and she thought one single thought: if my father were alive, you would never dare. But here is what Clara did not know. Her father Asterisk was alive. And this marriage, this cruel, cold, impossible marriage, was no accident at all. They say every bride remembers her wedding day forever. Clara would remember hers too, but not for the flowers, not for the vows. She would remember it for the sound of a scrubbing brush against a cold marble floor at 2 o'clock in the morning. Let us go back 12 hours. The wedding itself had been beautiful on the surface. The chapel at Blackwood Manor was filled with white roses. Half of London's high society sat in the pews, whispering behind their fans. And oh, how they whispered. "Who is she?" "A nobody, my dear. An orphan, raised by a poor aunt in a village no one has ever heard of." "Then why on earth is the Duke of Blackwood marrying her?" Why indeed? That was the question everyone asked, including the groom himself. Adrian, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, stood at the altar like a man standing before a firing squad. He was tall, dark-haired, and handsome enough to make every young lady in London sigh. But that day his gray eyes held no warmth at all. Only fury. Cold, controlled, silent fury. Because Adrian did not choose this bride. His grandfather had chosen her from the grave. The old Duke had died 6 months earlier, and when the lawyers read his will, Adrian's world turned upside down. The words were burned into his memory. "My grandson Adrian shall inherit the title, the manor, and the entire Blackwood fortune on one condition. He must marry the daughter of Edward Whitfield within 1 year of my death. If he refuses, everything shall pass to my second grandson, Rupert's son." Adrian had read the will 3 times. Then he had thrown it into the fire. Edward Whitfield. Of all the names in England, asterisk that asterisk name. Because everyone knew what Edward Whitfield had done. 18 years ago, Whitfield had been his father's business partner and closest friend. And 18 years ago, Whitfield had betrayed him, forged documents, stolen money, ruined the family's shipping company. The scandal had destroyed Adrian's parents. Within a year, both of them were dead. Adrian was 10 years old when he stood at their graves. And Whitfield had fled England on a ship and drowned at sea like the coward he was. Or so the story went. Now, 18 years later, Adrian was being forced to marry the daughter of the man who had destroyed his family. Forced by his own grandfather. It made no sense. It was madness. It was cruelty from beyond the grave. But the Blackwood fortune was enormous, and the alternative was losing everything to his Uncle Rupert's side of the family. So Adrian gritted his teeth, sent his lawyers to find the girl, and set the date. Clara had said yes for one simple reason. She had no choice either. Her aunt was old and sick and drowning in debts. The Duke's lawyers had offered to pay everything. All Clara had to do was sign her life away to a stranger. "Perhaps he is kind," her aunt had whispered hopefully on the morning of the wedding. "He was not kind." At the altar, when the bishop told him he could kiss his bride, Adrian looked at Clara for the first time, really looked at her. She was beautiful, though no one had told her so in years. Soft brown hair, gentle hazel eyes, and a quiet dignity that money could not buy. Adrian leaned toward her, but he did not kiss her. Instead, he whispered into her ear, so quietly that only she could hear. "Do not mistake this for a marriage, Miss Whitfield. You are a condition in a will, nothing more." Then he straightened, took her arm, and smiled for the crowd. Clara did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She simply lifted her chin and walked down the aisle beside her new husband, while all of London society applauded a love that did not exist. The wedding feast lasted until midnight. Clara sat at the head table like a beautiful doll, spoken about, but never spoken to asterisk. The Duke drank his wine and laughed with his friends and did not look at her once. Only one person was watching Clara that evening, an older man with silver hair and sharp, pale eyes, Lord Rupert, the Duke's uncle. He watched her the way a hawk watches a mouse. At one point, he raised his glass to her and smiled. It was the coldest smile Clara had ever seen. And then at last the guests were gone, the doors were closed, the servants were sent to bed. And the Duke came down the marble staircase with a bucket and a brush. "You will learn what you are in this house," he said. "I want this ballroom floor shining by morning, and you will do it in that dress." For a long moment Clara did not move. The great clock in the hall ticked. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed softly, a servant, pretending not to see. "Well," the Duke said, "or shall I have the marriage annulled tomorrow and send you back to your village? Your aunt's debts would return with you, of course." There it was, the chain around her neck. Clara knelt down. Her white silk gown pooled around her on the cold marble. She picked up the brush with steady hands. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said quietly. Something flickered in Adrian's eyes just for a second. Perhaps he had expected tears, screaming, begging. This quiet dignity unsettled him more than any of those things would have. "The daughter of a thief," he said, "scrubbing my floors. My grandfather would be proud of his little joke." He turned and walked up the stairs without looking back. Clara dipped the brush into the cold water and began to scrub. 1 hour passed, then 2. Her knees ached. Her hands turned red and raw. The beautiful wedding gown was soaked and gray at the hem, but she did not stop and she did not cry. Instead, she did what she always did in the darkest moments of her life. She held the small golden locket that hung around her neck. It was the only thing she had from her father. Inside there was no portrait, only a strange engraved crest she had never been able to identify. 2 lions and a rising sun. Her aunt had told her, "Your father put this around your neck the day before his ship sailed. He said, tell her to never take it off. Tell her that one day she will understand." He had drowned at sea. She was 4 years old. She did not even remember his face. "Papa," she whispered to the empty ballroom, "if you could see me now." At 3 o'clock in the morning, a floorboard creaked. Clara turned, startled. It was Mrs. Hobbs, the old housekeeper, in her nightgown and shawl, carrying a cup of hot tea and a piece of bread with honey. "Ma'am," the old woman whispered, kneeling beside her with difficulty, "drink this, please. If he sees you." "His Grace is asleep." Mrs. Hobbs pressed the warm cup into Clara's raw, red hands. Her old eyes were wet. "40 years I have served this family. I served his mother, God rest her soul. And I will tell you this, ma'am, she would weep at what this house has become." Clara drank the tea. It was the first kindness anyone had shown her all day, and it nearly broke her where cruelty could not. "Why does he hate me so much, Mrs. Hobbs?" she asked softly. "He does not even know me." The old housekeeper was quiet for a moment. Then she said something strange. "It is not you he hates, child. It is a ghost, And God help this house. She glanced at the dark staircase, because I do not believe that ghost is finished with us yet. By dawn, the ballroom floor was shining like a mirror. Clara stood up on trembling legs, gathered her ruined wedding gown, and walked slowly toward the room she had been given, a small, cold chamber in the east wing, far from the Duke's apartments. A servant's room in everything but name. She was passing the library when she heard voices behind the heavy oak door. The Duke, and another man, his lawyer, who had stayed the night. Clara knew she should keep walking. She did not. The terms of the will are clear, the lawyer was saying. The marriage must last 1 full year, Your Grace. After that, the Duke's voice cut in, cold and precise. You will file for annulment. I want it prepared in advance. The moment the year is over, I will put her out of this house with nothing but the dress she came in. No settlement, no allowance, nothing. And if she contests it, she is a penniless orphan with no family and no friends. Who would stand up for her? A pause, the sound of a glass being set down. 1 year, Mr. Grimsby. I will endure the thief's daughter for 1 year, and then Clara Whitfield will disappear as if she never existed. Behind the door, Clara stood frozen, her hand pressed against her mouth, her wedding gown dripping cold water onto the floor. As if she never existed. She turned and walked away on silent feet, her heart pounding. And as she climbed the servants' staircase to her cold little room, she made herself a promise. She would survive this year. She had survived worse. But there was one thing Clara could not know that morning, one thing that would have changed everything. At that very moment, in a grand office overlooking the harbor of Bombay, on the other side of the world, a silver-haired gentleman was reading a letter from England, a letter that contained 2 words that made his hands shake for the first time in 18 years. The letter said, "It is done. She is inside Blackwood Manor." The gentleman folded the letter and looked out at the sea. On his desk stood a small portrait of a 4-year-old girl with soft brown hair and hazel eyes. "Soon, my darling," Edward Whitfield whispered, "soon." There is a strange thing about cruelty. It always believes it will win. The Duke of Blackwood believed it too. He believed that within a month, the quiet girl he had forced to scrub his ballroom floor would be broken, weeping, begging to be released. He was, after all, a man who had never once been wrong about anything. He was about to be wrong about everything. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding night, and life at Blackwood Manor had settled into a cold, silent routine. Clara, her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood, at least on paper, did not eat in the grand dining room. On the second morning of her marriage, she had come down to breakfast, and the Duke had looked up from his newspaper and said 6 words. "Your place is with the servants." The footmen had frozen. Mrs. Hobbs had gone pale, but Clara had simply nodded, picked up her plate and walked down the long corridor to the servants' hall, her head held high, her steps unhurried, as if she were walking into a royal banquet. And that was where the strangest thing began to happen. Because the servants of Blackwood Manor had expected a spoiled, bitter woman, instead they got Clara. It started with small things. When the scullery maid, little Betsy, burned her hand on a kettle, it was the Duchess who cleaned the wound and wrapped it with her own handkerchief. When the cook's eyesight grew too poor to read her recipes, it was the Duchess who sat beside her and read them aloud every single morning without ever being asked. And when Thomas, the old footman, fell ill with a terrible cough, and his little grandson cried in the servants' hall because there was no money for medicine, it was Clara who disappeared into the kitchen garden and returned with her hands full of herbs. "My aunt taught me," she said simply, boiling them into a dark syrup. "We never had money for doctors either." Within 3 days, old Thomas was on his feet. Within 3 weeks, there was not a single servant at Blackwood Manor who would not have walked through fire for the servant Duchess. That was what they called her below stairs, first as a whisper of pity, then as a title of honor. "She's more of a lady than any fine lady I ever served," the cook declared one evening, stirring her soup. "And him upstairs, him with all his silver and his cold face, he doesn't deserve to polish her shoes." "Hush now," Mrs. Hobbs warned, but she did not disagree. The Duke saw none of this, or rather he chose to see none of it. But sometimes, from the window of his study, he would notice his wife in the garden, kneeling in the dirt beside the gardener's boy, teaching him to plant seedlings. He would hear, faintly, through the floorboards, the sound of laughter from the servants' hall, laughter that had not been heard in that house for 18 years. And each time something twisted in his chest, something he refused to name. "She is playing a game," he told himself, turning back to his papers. "The daughter of a thief playing at sainthood. I will not be fooled by a Whitfield. Not again. Never again." At night, Clara sat alone in her small, cold room in the East Wing, mending her own dresses by candlelight. She had exactly 3 dresses, all of them old, all of them patched. The Duke had given her no allowance, not 1 penny. The magnificent wardrobe that should have belonged to a duchess simply did not exist. She did not complain, but sometimes, when the candle burned low and the great house fell silent, Clara would open the small wooden box she had brought from her aunt's cottage. Inside there were only 3 things: a dried flower from her mother's grave, a letter from her aunt, with spelling mistakes and love in every line, and the golden locket. She would hold the locket up to the candlelight and study the strange crest engraved inside: 2 lions, a rising sun. She had shown it once years ago to the vicar in her village, the most educated man she knew. He had frowned at it for a long time. "This is not an English crest, child," he had finally said. "Or, not only English, this is old, very old. Where did you say your father got this?" She hadn't known, she still didn't. Her memories of her father were like pieces of a broken mirror. A deep, warm laugh, strong hands lifting her onto his shoulders, the smell of sea salt and pipe smoke, and one memory, sharper than all the others, the last one. She was 4 years old. It was night. Her father knelt in front of her, and there were tears in his eyes, the only time she ever saw him cry. He fastened the locket around her little neck with trembling fingers. "Never take it off, my darling," he whispered. "Promise your papa. No matter what anyone tells you about me, never take it off. One day you will understand everything." "Where are you going, Papa?" "Just a short journey, little bird, just a short journey." 2 months later, her mother stood in the doorway with a letter in her hand and her face as white as chalk. The ship was lost. All hands drowned. And within a year, the whispers began, whispers that followed Clara through her whole childhood like a shadow. "Thief, traitor, Whitfield." Her gentle mother faded away under the shame of it, dying before Clara turned 7. And so the little girl was sent to a poor aunt in a poor village, carrying nothing but a wooden box and a golden locket, and a name that all of England hated. Clara closed the locket and pressed it against her heart, the way she had done 10,000 times before. "One day you will understand everything," she whispered into the darkness. "Papa, when will that day come?" She could not know that the answer was, in exactly 4 days. It was a gray Thursday afternoon when the carriage arrived. Clara was in the entrance hall, arranging autumn roses in a vase. Mrs. Hobbs had quietly begun giving her small duties, real duties, the duties of the mistress of the house, and the Duke had not noticed or had not cared. When the great doors opened, a cold wind swept in, and with it came a tall man in an elegant gray coat. Lord Rupert, the Duke's uncle. Clara remembered him from the wedding. the silver-haired man with the hawk's eyes and the coldest smile in England. He handed his hat to the footman and let his gaze travel slowly around the hall, like a man inspecting property he expected to own very soon. Then his eyes found Clara. "Ah," he said softly, "the little Duchess herself, arranging flowers, how very domestic." Clara curtsied politely. "Lord Rupert, I am afraid His Grace has ridden out to the North Fields. He is not expected back until evening." "I know," said Lord Rupert. Something about the way he said it made the hair on Clara's neck stand up. "I know. He had come precisely because Adrian was away." "Then perhaps you would care for some tea while you wait," she said carefully. "Tea?" He smiled that cold smile and stepped closer, too close. "Do you know, my dear, I confess I was curious about you, the mysterious bride from nowhere, the girl my dear departed father-in-law," his voice curdled slightly, "reached out of his grave to place inside this house. I asked myself why this girl, why a Whitfield?" "I have asked myself the same question, my lord," Clara said quietly. "Have you?" His pale eyes searched her face, feature by feature, as if he were reading a document. "How strange! You have her eyes, you know." Clara blinked. "Whose eyes, my lord?" For a moment, one single moment, something flickered across Lord Rupert's polished face, as if he had said one word more than he intended. "Your mother's, I imagine," he said smoothly. "I met her once, long ago, before your father's unpleasantness." He turned as if to walk toward the drawing room, and that was when it happened. Clara reached up to brush a loose strand of hair from her face. The movement shifted the collar of her dress, and the golden locket, which always lay hidden beneath the fabric, slipped free and swung into the light. It was only for a second. She tucked it back at once out of old habit. But a second was enough. Behind her, there was a sharp crash of breaking glass. Clara spun around. Lord Rupert had taken a glass of sherry from the footman's tray, and it now lay shattered at his feet, the dark liquid spreading across the marble like a bloodstain. But it was not the glass that frightened her. It was his face. Lord Rupert, the composed, icy, untouchable Lord Rupert, was staring at her throat. His face had gone the color of ash. His hand, still curved around a glass that was no longer there, was visibly trembling. "My lord," the footman said, alarmed. "My lord, are you unwell?" Lord Rupert did not answer. He did not even hear. He was still staring at the small shape hidden beneath the collar of Clara's dress, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out as a whisper that seemed to come from 18 years away. "Where," he said slowly, "did you get that?" "Get what, my lord?" Clara's hand rose to her collar. "That locket." He took a step toward her. The broken glass crunched under his boot. "Where did you get that locket?" And in that moment, standing in the great hall of Blackwood Manor, Clara understood two things with absolute, ice-cold certainty. The first, this man knew exactly what was engraved inside her locket, the two lions and the rising sun, without ever having opened it. And the second, for reasons she could not begin to imagine, he was afraid of it. Lord Rupert stayed at Blackwood Manor for less than an hour. By the time the footman had swept up the broken glass, his lordship had recovered his smooth voice and his cold smile. "Forgive me, my dear," he said lightly, "a dizzy spell. My physician warns me about sherry on an empty stomach." He laughed. The laugh did not reach his eyes. "That trinket of yours simply caught the light. It reminded me of something I saw once, long ago. It is nothing." But as his carriage rolled away down the long drive, Clara stood at the window and watched it go, her hand pressed flat against the locket beneath her dress. "It is nothing," he had said. Then why had he asked the footman, quietly at the door, when he thought no one was listening, which room the Duchess slept in? Mrs. Hobbs had heard it. And that night, without explaining why, the old housekeeper moved Clara's few belongings to a different chamber, one floor up, with a sturdy lock on the door. "The east wing is drafty this time of year," was all she said. The two women looked at each other. Neither of them believed it. Both of them pretended to. But 4 days later, all thoughts of Lord Rupert were swept away, because 4 days later the child came home. Clara had heard of Lady Lily, of course. The servants spoke of her the way people speak of sunlight in winter. The Duke's little sister, 9 years old, born when their mother was already broken by grief and scandal, orphaned before she could walk. Adrian was her guardian, her whole family, her entire world. She had spent the autumn at their Greytants house in Bath, and now, at last, her carriage was rattling up the drive. Clara stood uncertainly in the hall, unsure of her place. Would the child even know she existed? Had anyone told her that her brother had a wife? The doors burst open, and a small whirlwind in a blue traveling coat flew inside and stopped dead. Lily stared up at Clara. Clara looked down at a small girl with her brother's dark hair and their mother's warm brown eyes, and a face still soft with childhood. "Are you her?" Lily breathed. "Are you my sister?" Clara's heart stumbled over the word, sister. "I suppose I am," she said softly, kneeling down to the child's height. "I'm Clara." Lily studied her with the terrible honesty of children. "Aunt Agatha says you are a scheming nobody who tricked my brother," she announced. "But Aunt Agatha also says chocolate ruins the complexion, so she is wrong about most things." She paused. "You have kind eyes. Will you plait my hair? Nobody in Bath could do it properly." And just like that, in the way that only children can, Lily made her choice. Within a week, the little girl was Clara's shadow. She trailed her through the gardens, sat beside her in the servants' hall. "It's much friendlier down here," she declared, to the cook's delight, and demanded stories every evening. And Clara, who had spent her whole life being nobody's anything, discovered what it felt like to be somebody's favorite person in the world. The Duke watched all of this with a face like a locked door. "Lily," he said one evening, finding her curled against Clara's side in the library, "it is time for bed, and you spend too many hours with—" He hesitated. "With my sister," Lily said innocently. A muscle moved in Adrian's jaw. "Go up to bed." Lily kissed Clara's cheek, deliberately, defiantly, and went. And for a moment, husband and wife were alone, the fire crackling between them. "Do not become attached to her," Adrian said quietly, not looking at Clara. "You will not be here long enough for it to matter." "She is a child who misses her mother," Clara answered. "Whatever you think of me, do not punish her for it." He looked at her then, and for the first time he seemed to have no answer at all. The fever came on a Tuesday. It began with nothing, Lily leaving her supper untouched, complaining that her head hurt. By midnight she was burning. By morning she could not recognize the faces around her bed. The physician came from the village, then a second one, summoned at desperate speed from London. Dr. Harlow was the finest physician money could buy, and Adrian, gray-faced and unshaven, stood in the corner of the nursery while the great man examined the tiny figure in the bed. Dr. Harlow straightened slowly, and he said the words that every parent in every century has feared more than death itself. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I have done all that can be done. The fever must break tonight or it will take her. I suggest that you say your goodbyes while she can still hear them." The room went silent. Somewhere a maid began to weep. Adrian did not move. He stood as if the words had turned him to stone, this man who commanded a fortune, who owned half a county, who had never once been powerless in his adult life. His whole family, his entire world, 9 years old. And then a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "May I try?" Every head turned. Clara stood there with her sleeves already rolled to the elbow, a basin of herbs and vinegar water in her hands. Dr. Harlow drew himself up. "Madam, this is a matter of medicine, not of kitchen remedies." "Then medicine has finished, sir, by your own words." Clara's voice was still soft, but underneath it there was iron that no one in that house had heard before. "Where I grew up, there was no money for doctors. When the fever came for the village children, my aunt fought it with her hands and her herbs and her stubbornness. I sat beside her through 12 winters. I watched her lose some." Her voice caught, then steadied. "I watched her save more." "Your Grace," the doctor said, turning to Adrian, "I must object. If this woman interferes and the child dies, the blame." "The child is dying anyway." It was Adrian who said it. His voice sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. He was looking at Clara, really looking at her, perhaps for the first time since the altar. "You heard him one night." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Can you save my sister?" "I don't know," Clara said honestly, "but I will not leave this room until it is decided. That I can promise you." For 3 days and 3 nights, the Duchess of Blackwood did not sleep. The servants told the story for years afterward, how she bathed the burning little body with vinegar water every hour, on the hour all night long. How she spooned willow bark tea between the child's cracked lips, drop by drop, with the patience of a saint. How she opened the windows when the London doctor had ordered them sealed, saying, "Fever hates clean air. My aunt taught me that before your medical school was built, sir." How she sang. That was the part Mrs. Hobbs could never tell without weeping. How, in the darkest hour of the second night, when the little girl trembled and cried out for her dead mother, Clara gathered her up, blankets and all, and rocked her, and sang the same soft village lullaby, over and over, until the crying stopped. And the Duke saw it all. He would not enter the nursery, as if crossing that threshold would make the danger real, but he could not leave it either. So he stood in the doorway, hour after hour, night after night, a silent statue in the shadows, watching a woman in a patched dress fight death itself for a child that was not hers. The woman he had humiliated, the woman he had exiled to the servants' table, the thief's daughter. On the 3rd night, near 4 in the morning, Clara pressed her hand to Lily's forehead for the 1000th time, and went completely still. Adrian saw it from the doorway. His heart stopped. "What is it?" His voice cracked. "What is it?" Clara turned. There were tears streaming down her exhausted face, and she was smiling. "The fever has broken. She's cool. She's Adrian. She's asking for breakfast." It was the first time she had ever spoken his name. A tiny voice rose from the pillows, thin but unmistakably indignant. "I want toast, with honey, and I want Clara to plait my hair. It's all horrible." The Duke of Blackwood crossed the nursery in 3 strides, sank onto the edge of the bed, and pulled his little sister into his arms. And then his shoulders began to shake, this cold, proud granite man, and Clara quietly turned away to give him privacy, because some things should not be watched. But as she gathered her basin at the door, she felt it, his eyes on her. She turned. Over Lily's dark head, Adrian was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was in it. It was not shame, though shame was in it too. It was the look of a man staring at a locked door he has just discovered inside his own house, a door leading to rooms he never knew existed. Clara, her name again, rough like an unused hinge. "She'll want the toast lightly browned," Clara said gently, "and she means it about the honey." And she slipped out, leaving the Duke of Blackwood alone with his sister, his silence, and the ruins of everything he had been so certain about. Far beyond the gardens, on the wooded hill overlooking Blackwood Manor, a man stood among the dark trees with a brass spyglass to his eye. He had been there every day that week. He was there at dawn, and he was there at dusk, a tall figure in a long black coat, motionless as the trees themselves, the glass trained always on the same windows. On the fourth morning, the stable boy met him on the road while leading a lame horse to the village. The man in the black coat stepped out from the hedgerow so suddenly that the boy yelped. "Easy, lad." The stranger's voice was low and even, foreign, somehow not in its accent, which was perfect English, but in its stillness. He held up a gold sovereign, shining in the gray light, a month's wages held between two fingers. "One answer, one coin, and you never saw me." The boy swallowed hard. What do you want to know, sir?" The man in black was silent a moment, and when the question finally came, it was the very last question the boy expected. "The lady of the house," the stranger said quietly, "the young Duchess." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes. "Is she happy?" Lily's fever broke, but fevers of that kind do not release children easily. She was left thin and pale as paper, and Dr. Harlow, humbler now, prescribed a long list before he returned to London. Strengthening tonics, iron drops, cod liver oil, beef tea, and a bottle of Peruvian bark extract that cost more than a footman earned in 2 months. "She must have all of it," the doctor said gravely. "Every week without fail through the winter, or the illness may return, and a second visit, your grace. I could not promise to win." Adrian nodded and paid the man his fee. And then, because grief and relief make men stupid, and pride makes them blind, he rode to London on business, leaving instructions with the steward about drainage ditches and timber sales. He forgot to leave a single penny for the medicines. It was not cruelty this time. It was worse in a way it simply never occurred to him. In the world of the Duke of Blackwood, medicines appeared on tables the way meals did, the way clean linen did. He had never in his life had to wonder how. Clara had spent her whole life wondering how. The steward, a careful man named Mr. Pratt, turned pale when Clara came to him with the apothecary's first bill. "Ma'am, I've no authority over the household purse, only the estate accounts. His Grace settles the household bills himself when he returns, perhaps in 3 weeks. The medicines are needed now, Mr. Pratt." "I know, ma'am." The poor man looked miserable. "I could write to His Grace in London." "No," Clara said it quickly, too quickly, because she could already imagine the letter's journey, and she could already hear, word for word, the reply of a man who had told her on her wedding night that she would leave this house with nothing. She would not beg him, not for herself, never. But this was for Lily, and for Lily she would have crawled to London on her knees. There was, however, one other way. That night Clara sat before the small mirror in her room and unpinned her hair. It fell down her back like a dark river, thick, soft, chestnut brown, reaching past her waist to her knees, her mother's hair. The one beauty poverty had never been able to take from her. Her aunt used to brush it on Sunday evenings, 100 strokes, saying, "Your father loved your mother's hair. He said it was the first thing he ever noticed, a girl by the harbor with hair like autumn." Clara looked at herself in the candlelight for a long, quiet moment. Then she picked up the scissors. The wig maker in the market town was a round little Frenchman who had made hairpieces for half the fine ladies of the county. When the veiled woman in the patched cloak unwrapped the bundle on his counter, he actually gasped. "Madame," he whispered, lifting the long braid with both hands like a holy relic. "Madame, in 30 years I have never such length, such health. Are you certain? Hair like this, it is 1 in 10,000. "How much?" Clara asked quietly. He named a sum. It covered the apothecary's bill for the entire winter, with enough left over for warm stockings for Lily, wool for the servants' Christmas, and a small parcel of tea and money for an old aunt in a distant village. "Then we are agreed," Clara said. The Frenchman counted the coins slowly, unhappily. He had bought hair from poor women all his life, and he knew what it meant when a woman with a lady's voice and a servant's cloak sold hair like this without bargaining. "Madame," he said gently as she turned to leave, Whoever it is for, I hope they know." Clara paused at the door. "They never will," she said. "That is rather the point." Adrian returned from London on a Friday evening, 3 weeks later. He noticed the change before his coat was off. Something in the house was different, warmer. Lily met him on the stairs, and there was color in her cheeks again. She chattered about her tonics. "The brown one is disgusting. The red one is nice." And about the new mittens Clara had knitted, and about 100 other things. And Adrian was so busy drinking in the sight of his sister, healthy and loud and alive, that it took him 2 full days to notice the other thing. The Duchess had stopped wearing her hair down in the evenings. It was always pinned now, always capped, always covered. It was Lily, of course, who let it slip. Children always do. "Clara's hair is short now, like a boy's almost," she announced at breakfast, buttering her toast. "I told her I like it, but she cried anyway. She thought I didn't see, but I did." Adrian set down his cup. "Short." Lily, sensing too late that she had wandered somewhere forbidden, became very interested in her toast. That afternoon, Adrian went looking for answers, and he found them where the truth of any great house lives, below stairs. Mrs. Hobbs stood before him in her parlor, hands folded, and for the first time in 40 years of service, the old woman looked at her master with something dangerously close to anger. "You wish to know about her Grace's hair, your Grace? Then you shall have it all." And she told him the doctor's list, the empty purse, the steward's helplessness, the braid wrapped in brown paper, the wig maker. "She sold it," Adrian repeated. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "For the little one's medicines. Yes, your Grace, and stockings and the servants' Christmas wool." Mrs. Hobbs's chin came up. "You'll forgive an old woman's tongue, sir, but you were in London settling accounts of every kind, and your wife was selling the hair off her head so your sister would not fall ill again. And she made us all swear on the Bible never to tell you. So I'll thank you to shout at me and not at her, for I've just broken my oath." Adrian did not shout. He stood in the housekeeper's little parlor, the Duke of Blackwood, master of 40,000 acres, a man who had spent 3 weeks in London and had, in a single careless evening at his club, lost more at cards than the cost of every medicine in England. And he felt something he had not felt since he was 10 years old, standing at his parents' graves. He felt small. That evening he found Clara in the library, reading to Lily by the fire. He stood in the doorway with an apology rising in his throat, a real one, the first of his adult life. He had rehearsed it on the stairs. "You shame me. You have shamed me since the day I met you, and the shame is mine, not yours." Clara looked up. "Your Grace, did you need something?" And his pride, that old, cold, iron habit, slammed the door of him shut. "The accounts," he heard himself say stiffly. "From now on you will have a proper allowance. A duchess of this house cannot be seen economizing. It reflects on the family. It reflects on the family." Even as the words left his mouth, he hated them. Something flickered in Clara's eyes and died. "Of course," she said quietly. "The family, thank you, your Grace." She turned back to Lily's book. Dismissed by a woman in a patched dress, more completely than a king could have dismissed him, Adrian went out and closed the door and stood in the dark corridor for a long time, despising himself with a thoroughness he usually reserved for the name Whitfield. "Tomorrow," he swore, "tomorrow I will say it properly." But tomorrow brought Lord Rupert's carriage instead. His uncle arrived unannounced, all smiles and gifts, sugared almonds for Lily, brandy for Adrian, and this time he did not come alone. From the carriage stepped a vision in emerald silk, Miss Arabella Fanshawe, only daughter of the richest banker in London, 22 years old and beautiful the way a new coin is beautiful. "Passing through the county," Rupert said smoothly. "You'll give us a bed for a night or two, nephew. Miss Fanshawe has heard so much about the manor." At dinner, the seating had somehow arranged itself so that Miss Fanshawe glittered at Adrian's right hand while Clara sat far down the table in her gray dress and her pinned cap. Rupert steered the conversation like a coachman. Miss Fanshawe's dowry, delicately mentioned. Miss Fanshawe's connections. And then, over the pheasant, the knife slid out of the velvet. "Of course," Rupert said lightly, swirling his wine, "your grandfather's will only requires the marriage to last a year, nephew. It says nothing of what comes after. A quiet annulment next autumn, a suitable settlement, and a man could begin again properly this time, with a wife of his own choosing." He smiled down the table at Clara. "No offense intended, my dear. Business is business. I'm sure a sensible girl like you has always understood the arrangement." The table went silent. Lily froze, fork in the air. Every servant in the room stopped breathing. Clara set down her glass and met Rupert's eyes and said with perfect, devastating calm, "None taken, my lord. I have been told what I am in this house since my first night in it." Adrian's head came up sharply, but before he could speak, and he was going to speak, something in his face had gone white and dangerous. Rupert laughed and turned the conversation to hunting, and the moment was buried. What no one at that table understood, not Adrian, not Clara, not the glittering Miss Fanshawe, was that Rupert cared nothing for bankers' daughters or wedding settlements. Rupert was a man in a hurry. Rupert was a man afraid. Because 18 years of careful silence had been built on one certainty, that everything from that time was burned, drowned, and buried. And then, 3 weeks ago, in the entrance hall of this very house, he had seen a dead man's locket swinging from a living girl's neck. The girl had to go, quickly, cleanly, legally, annulled and vanished back into poverty where no one would ever look at her twice. That was the tidy way. But first he needed to know what she knew, and he needed that locket. That night, long past midnight, when the house lay dark and even the kitchen fires were banked, a candle flame moved silently up the stairs of the east wing. Lord Rupert had made his inquiries weeks ago. He knew which room had been the Duchess's. The door was unlocked. The room was empty, stripped, bare mattress, cold hearth, empty drawers. He stood there in the flickering dark and his jaw tightened. Moved. Someone moved her. It took him half an hour of soft-footed searching to find the new door, 1 floor up. He tried the handle with infinite care. Locked, a good heavy iron lock. From inside came the quiet, even breathing of a sleeping woman. Rupert stood at that door for a long moment, candle in hand, his shadow stretching down the corridor behind him like something waiting. Then he drew from his pocket a thin ring of steel picks, a strange thing, you might think, for a lord to carry. The lock resisted. He worked patiently. He had always been a patient man. Patience was how he had done it the first time, 18 years ago. Clicking. The door of the Duchess's room swung open into darkness, 1 inch, then 2. And down the corridor, sharp and sudden as a gunshot, another door opened and light flooded the passage. "Uncle." Adrian stood in the corridor in his shirt sleeves, a candle in one hand, his eyes cold and level. For a moment that stretched like wire, the two men looked at each other over the little flames. "I could not sleep," Adrian said quietly. "It appears to be a family affliction. You seem lost, uncle. Your rooms are in the West Wing." Lord Rupert left Blackwood Manor the next morning, smooth as oil. "Sleepwalking, dear boy," he said over breakfast, shaking his head at himself. "A curse of our bloodline. Your grandfather did it too, woke once in the stables, fully dressed. You should lock your corridors." "I intend to," said Adrian. The two men smiled at each other with their mouths only, and Miss Fanshawe, who understood nothing, chattered brightly about the weather. But at the carriage door, Rupert paused and played his last card. "The winter ball, nephew. Your father held one every December, the finest night in the county before. It is time this house remembered what it is. Hold the ball, all of society will come. He glanced up at the windows where a small face Lily was watching, and beside her a woman in gray, all asterisk of it, let London finally meet your Duchess. It was a trap, and Adrian knew it was a trap. Rupert wanted Clara displayed before the cream of society exactly as she was, patched, shorn, provincial, so that when the annulment came, all of London would nod and say, of course, the poor man had no choice. Adrian knew all this, and to his own surprise he heard himself answer, "The second Friday of December, I'll have the invitation sent." Because somewhere in the last 3 days, perhaps in a corridor at midnight, perhaps in a housekeeper's parlor, perhaps at the door of a nursery, the Duke of Blackwood had quietly stopped playing his uncle's game and had begun, without fully admitting it to himself, to play a different one. The news went through the servants' hall like wind through wheat. A ball. The first in 18 years, 300 guests, society coming here. And then on the heels of the excitement, the dread, because every soul below stairs did the same arithmetic in the same second. Their Duchess had 3 dresses, all of them gray, all of them patched. The finest ladies of England were coming, dripping in silk and diamonds. They would take one look at her and tear her to pieces. "She'll not buy a gown either," said the cook grimly. "Not Our Lady. She'll spend that allowance on liniment for Thomas's knees and boots for Betsy, you watch." They watched. That is precisely what she did. So the servants of Blackwood Manor held a council of war, and it was Mrs. Hobbs who rose, went to her cupboard, and took down a key that no one had touched in 18 years. The attic of the West Tower was cold as a church. There, beneath white sheets, stood the trunks of the late Duchess, Adrian's mother, sealed since the year of the scandal. Mrs. Hobbs opened the 3rd trunk, folded back the tissue, and lifted out a river of midnight blue silk, sewn with tiny silver stars. "She wore it once," the old woman whispered. "The last winter ball. She stood at the top of those stairs, and the whole county forgot to breathe." For 2 weeks by candlelight after their work was done, the women of Blackwood Manor sewed. The gown was let out here, taken in there, remade around Clara's measurements, taken in secret by the ingenious method of hugging her frequently. Betsy ruined her eyes on the star embroidery. The cook, who had not held a needle in years, hemmed until midnight, muttering, "Him upstairs doesn't deserve her, but by heaven they'll *C* her." On the night of the ball, they knocked on her door and carried it in. Clara looked at the gown spread across her bed, at the row of tired, shining, expectant faces, and for the first time since her wedding, the woman who had not wept while scrubbing marble at 2 in the morning sat down and cried like a child. "We're your people, ma'am," said Mrs. Hobbs simply. "A duchess dresses to honor her house. Well, you are our house." By 9 o'clock, Blackwood Manor blazed like a lit cathedral. 300 guests, diamonds and medals, silk and scandal. Miss Arabella Fanshawe arrived in cloth of gold on Lord Rupert's arm and was radiant and knew it. And the whispers were already hunting. Where is she then, the mystery Duchess? Hiding, I should think. They say she dines with the * servants *, my dear. They say he married a beggar to satisfy a madman's will. The Ragged Duchess, they call her. They say her hair was sold off her head like a farm girl's. Fans fluttered, eyes gleamed. Society had come for a ball, but it had also come, as it always comes, for blood. And then the music faltered. Because at the top of the great staircase, the same staircase at whose foot she had once knelt with a scrubbing brush, stood a woman in midnight blue silk sewn with silver stars. Her short chestnut hair was dressed close and crowned with a simple band of winter roses, and it made her look, said an old general later, like a queen from a legend, the kind who has been to war. She wore no diamonds. She wore one small golden locket. The whole ballroom forgot to breathe. And no one forgot to breathe more completely than the Duke of Blackwood, who stood at the foot of the stairs and looked up at his wife in his mother's gown, which he recognized in a single heartbeat, and felt 18 years of winter crack inside his chest like ice on a thawing river. Rupert's face across the ballroom was a study in ash. He too recognized the gown. He looked, for one unguarded moment, like a man who has seen the dead walk down a staircase. Clara descended. Adrian could not have said afterward how he crossed the floor. But society recovers quickly. Malice always finds its feet. Within the hour, the whispers had regrouped. Clara stood alone by a pillar. The great ladies had frozen her out with the exquisite cruelty of their kind, turning their circles just so, leaving her stranded on an island of polished floor. Miss Fanshawe drifted past with her court and observed, in a voice built to carry, "Charming, the gown, quite vintage. Though of course anything looks well when one is accustomed to asterisk so much less." Laughter, silver and poisonous. Clara stood very straight, cheeks burning, and reached quietly for the wall of dignity that had carried her through her whole life. It held, but it was tired, and she turned toward the doors to slip away. "Excuse me." The voice cut across the ballroom like a saber. The music stopped mid-phrase. The conductor's baton hung in the air. 300 heads turned. The Duke of Blackwood walked across the empty center of his ballroom, footsteps ringing, straight to the woman by the pillar. He stopped before her and bowed, not a nod, but the full, formal, ancient bow of a gentleman to a great lady. "You have not danced, madam," he said, and his voice carried to every candle and every corner. "Neither have I find I have been waiting all evening." He held out his hand, palm up. "I wish to dance with my wife." If lightning had struck the chandelier, the effect would have been smaller. Clara stared at his open hand. 100 voices whispered in her memory. Thief's daughter, condition in a will as if she never existed. And here it was, that same hand, open before all of England. "They are watching, your grace," she said softly. "Yes," said Adrian, "let them learn." She placed her hand in his. The orchestra, after one violent glare from Mrs. Hobbs at the ballroom door, swept into a waltz. They said afterward, the people who were there, that they had never seen two people dance like that. As if they were alone, as if the room were empty, as if the music had been written that afternoon for them only. Adrian looked down at his wife and found he could not remember a single one of his rehearsed, frozen sentences. "The gown was my mother's," he finally said. "Your servants love you more than you deserve," Clara answered. "They wanted your mother at this ball. I am only the messenger." "No," his hand tightened at her waist. "No, you are not only asterisk anything. Clara, I have been a blind man in my own house. I have things to say to you, things that will take longer than one waltz." Her heart was hammering. "Then you'll have to be quick, your grace. The waltz is ending." "Then walk with me. The garden 5 minutes." The winter garden was cold and blazing with torchlight, and the music floated out through the glass. They walked between the sleeping roses, and for once neither of them armored, neither of them fencing. And when they stopped beneath the old sundial, Adrian turned to her and began, clumsily, magnificently, "That first night. What I did to you that first night I will spend." He never finished. She had looked up at him and he had stopped speaking, and the distance between them closed slowly, like a tide coming in, his hand rising to her cheek. "Your grace, your grace." A footman, running, breathless, appalled at himself. "Forgive me, the Countess of Marsh has fainted at the supper table. They are asking for the Duchess." The moment broke like a soap bubble. Clara stepped back, flushed, half laughing. "Duty, it seems," she whispered. "Hold that thought, your grace." "Adrian," he said. "My name when we are alone is Adrian." "Hold that thought," she said. "Adrian." The supper room was chaos of the mildest kind. The Countess of Marsh fainted at every ball she attended. It was practically her calling card. Clara loosened the old lady's collar, called for smelling salts, and settled her in an armchair with tea, all with the calm competence that made ladies of a certain age adore her on sight. "You're a good girl," the old countess declared, patting her hand. "Whatever they say about you, sit, drink something, you're flushed." A glass of wine appeared at Clara's elbow, one of dozens circulating on silver trays through the crush of the supper room, in the hands of hired footmen brought in for the night, faces no one knew. She was thirsty and happy, and 20 minutes ago a man had almost kissed her in a torchlit garden. She drank. It tasted for half a second faintly of bitter almonds. But the countess was talking, and the room was loud, and happiness makes people careless. 10 minutes later, Clara excused herself and stood, and the room tilted sideways. The candles smeared into long ribbons of light. Sound arrived from very far away. She caught at the back of a chair and missed and heard, distantly, a crash of china and someone screaming her name, a child's voice, Lily's asterisk voice, and then the polished floor was rushing up to meet her. The last thing Clara saw through the closing dark was the ballroom doors, and a tall figure shoving through the crowd toward her, white-faced, roaring her name. Adrian asterisk, she thought. I never held the thought. Then nothing. Chaos, doctors, the ball dissolving in whispers, and in the small hours the verdict handed down to 300 departing guests, bad oysters, the supper oysters without question. The Countess of Marsh had felt queasy herself. Bad oysters, regrettable, embarrassing, and by morning official. But while the great house churned above, an old woman moved quietly through the wreckage of the supper room with a tray, collecting glasses like any housekeeper after any ball. One glass she did not send to the scullery. One glass with the dregs of red wine still in it, and a faint bitter smell that Mrs. Hobbs, who had kept house for 40 years and buried 2 rat catchers' worth of poison in her time, knew was asterisk not oysters. One glass she wrapped in a linen napkin, carried to her parlor, and locked in the cupboard where she kept the key to the West Tower. Then she sat down by her small fire, folded her hands and stared into the flames. "Now then," the old woman said softly to no one, "now then, which of you fine gentlefolk upstairs is trying to murder my lady?" Clara slept for 2 days. The doctors called it exhaustion after the oysters. Adrian did not leave the corridor outside her room. He heard none of the reassurances. He simply sat in a hard chair against the wall, unshaven, still in his ball clothes, and every hour he asked the same question of whoever came out of that door. Is she awake? On the second evening, Mrs. Hobbs came to him. She did not curtsy. She simply held out something wrapped in a linen napkin. "Before you hear one more word about oysters, Your Grace," the old woman said quietly, "you had better smell this." Adrian unwrapped the glass. He raised it, breathed in, and went very still. He was a duke, but he was also a man who had spent a year in Vienna in his youth, and he had once watched an inquest there, and he knew that faint scent of bitter almonds the way a soldier knows powder smoke. For a long moment he stared into the dregs of the wine, and his hand was absolutely steady, which was somehow more frightening than trembling. "Who served this glass?" "A hired man, Your Grace, brought in for the night with 20 others, gone by dawn, and the agency has no record of one of the names on its list." She paused. "One more thing, sir. It is not my place." "Mrs. Hobbs, your place from tonight is to tell me everything you have ever thought better of telling me." So she told him. The visit that had happened weeks ago, while he was at the North Fields, a broken sherry glass, a locket, and his lordship's face gone the color of ash. His lordship's quiet question at the door about which room the Duchess slept in. The lock Mrs. Hobbs had bought the next morning with her own wages. And Adrian listened, and the temperature of the corridor seemed to drop degree by degree, and at the end he said only, Thank you. Say nothing to anyone. Watch her door tonight." Then he went down to his grandfather's study, lit every candle in the room, and began to dig up the past with his bare hands. He started with the will, the mad, cruel, inexplicable will. He must marry the daughter of Edward Whitfield. For 6 months, Adrian had read that sentence as an old man's final insult. Now, for the first time, he read it as a message. His grandfather had been many things: cold, proud, unbending, but never in 80 years unreasonable. If he had chained his heir to the daughter of the man who destroyed this family, he'd had a reason. Adrian found the first thread in the estate ledgers, payments in the last 2 years of the old Duke's life to a private inquiry agent in London, then to a second agent in Lisbon, a third in Bombay. His grandfather, in secret at the end of his life, had been searching the world for something, or someone. And in the locked bottom drawer of the desk, the key to which Adrian had to break, he found the papers of the scandal itself, the famous letters, the evidence that had destroyed the Whitfield name, and with it his own parents, correspondence in Edward Whitfield's hand, arranging the fraudulent transfers, signing away the company's fortune to accounts in Amsterdam. Adrian had never actually seen them. He had been 10. One did not show such things to a child. One simply raised the child on their poison. He read them now, all of them, twice. And then, because his grandfather's drawer held other things too, he laid beside them a bundle of genuine letters. Edward Whitfield's real correspondence with Adrian's father. 20 years of friendship. Business, jokes, congratulations on children born, kiss little Adrian for his godfather, asterisk, and Adrian's breath stopped in his throat, because no one in 18 years had ever told him that Edward Whitfield was his godfather. He put the letters side by side under the candles. The forger had been brilliant. The hand was almost perfect, almost. But the real Whitfield crossed his T's with a little upward flick, like a wave goodbye. The fraud's T's lay flat. The real Whitfield wrote affairs with a long, looping F. The fraud's F was cramped. Small things, invisible things unless a man sat with 40 letters and a magnifying lens and a growing horror at 3 o'clock in the morning. The letters that had destroyed the Whitfields, that had shattered his father, broken his mother, and poured hatred into a 10-year-old boy like poison into a well, were forgeries. Everyone. And beneath them, at the very bottom of the drawer, in his grandfather's own iron hand, a single unfinished note. It was dated 11 days before the old man's death. I know now what was done, and I begin to see by whom, though I cannot yet prove the hand behind the pen. God forgive me, we buried an innocent man's name, and I fear worse was done to him than slander. If I do not live to finish this, then the marriage must do what I cannot. It will put his blood under this roof, under our protection, and it will force my proud fool of a grandson to look. Adrian, if you are reading this, look at the letters. Look at the T's, boy, and then look to your own. The note stopped there, mid-sentence. 11 days later, his grandfather's heart had stopped too, quietly, in his sleep. At the time, no one had thought anything of it. He was an old man. Look to your own. Your own what? Your own house, your own family, your own. Adrian sat back in the cold study, surrounded by dead men's paper, and the clock struck 4, and the truth stood in the room with him like a figure he had walked past every day of his life without turning his head. Someone had forged the letters. Someone had aimed 18 years of hatred at an innocent man and his innocent daughter. Someone had been inside this family's trust, its accounts, its seals and stationery. Someone had panicked at the sight of a locket. Someone had picked a lock at midnight. Someone had hired a footman with no name to carry one particular glass of wine. He had no proof, not yet, but he no longer had any doubt. Dawn was gray in the windows when Adrian climbed the stairs. He stood before Clara's door for a moment, and then the Duke of Blackwood, 9th of his name, master of 40,000 acres, went down on his knees on the bare corridor floor and knocked. The door opened. Clara stood there in her shawl, pale from her sickbed, her short hair loose, and found her husband kneeling at her threshold like a penitent at a shrine, with candle smoke in his clothes and ruin in his face. "Adrian," she reached for him, alarmed. "What's happened? Get up." His voice was hoarse. "No, this is long overdue, and I'll say it from here or not at all." He looked up at her. "Your father is innocent, Clara, I can prove it. The letters were forged, all of them. Your father never stole anything, never betrayed anyone. He was my father's truest friend. He was my asterisk godfather. And this family, my family, repaid him by burying his name in filth and letting his wife die of the shame of it and letting his daughter grow up in poverty carrying it. And I—" His voice broke. He gathered it again. "I finished what they started. I stood at an altar with the finest woman I have ever known and whispered cruelty into her ear. I threw a scrubbing brush at the feet of the woman who would sit up 3 nights to save my sister. I let you sell the hair off your head in my own house. There are not words, Clara. There are no words in English for what I owe you. So I will not ask you to forgive me. I only ask you to let me spend the rest of my life in the attempt to deserve." He never finished that sentence either. This family had a habit of unfinished sentences. Because Clara had knelt down on the cold floor in front of him, taken his exhausted face in both her hands, and finished the kiss the winter garden had begun. What followed were 3 weeks that the servants of Blackwood Manor would talk about for the rest of their lives. The 3 golden weeks. The Duke and Duchess breakfasted together at one small table, scandalously close, every morning. He had her mother-in-law's jewels brought out of the vaults, and she wore the sapphires exactly once, to please him, and then went back to the locket, which pleased him more. They walked the frozen gardens arm in arm. They read in the library in the evenings, Lily sprawled between them like a satisfied cat, and sometimes the servants passing the door would hear a sound so unfamiliar in that house that it stopped them mid-step. The Duke of Blackwood, laughing. He told her everything in those weeks, the forgeries, the flicked teas, his grandfather's unfinished note. They agreed to say nothing and change nothing until proof could be found. The enemy, whoever he was, and neither of them said the name aloud, though both of them thought it, believed himself safe, and safe men grow careless. "There's one thing I don't understand," Clara said one night, her head on his shoulder, the locket glinting in the firelight. "The note said worse was done to him than slander, but Adrian, my father, drowned. The ship went down in a storm, even the newspapers." "I know," Adrian said quietly. And then, after a silence, "Clara, has it never once seemed strange to you that your father's last act on earth was to tie a locket around your neck and make a 4-year-old swear never to remove it? A man boarding a ship for a routine crossing." Clara sat up slowly. "You think he knew," she whispered. "You think he knew something was going to happen to him?" Adrian looked into the fire. "I think," he said, "that we have been reading this story from the middle, and I would give this entire estate to know how it began." He would not have to give the estate. The beginning of the story was, at that very moment, 4 days out from Portsmouth in heavy seas, standing at a ship's rail in a long black coat, watching England rise out of the winter fog. It came on a Tuesday. Mid-morning, cold and bright. Lily was at her lessons. Clara and Adrian were in the morning room, arguing happily about spring. He wanted to take her to Vienna. She wanted to plant an orchard when they heard it, wheels on the gravel of the great drive. A carriage, but not a caller's carriage. Through the window they watched it come up the long avenue, enormous, gleaming, black as a beetle, drawn by 4 black horses with outriders. It was the kind of equipage that traveled with royalty or with bankers who owned royalty. It stopped before the doors. A footman in dark livery leapt down and opened the carriage door, and out stepped a tall gentleman, straight-backed, in a long black traveling coat. Silver-haired, sun-browned in a country of pale men. He stood for a moment and looked up at the face of Blackwood Manor slowly from end to end, window by window, the way a man looks at something he has imagined every night for 18 years. The bell rang through the house like judgment. By the time Adrian and Clara reached the hall, the butler was already there, holding a silver tray with a single calling card, and the visitor stood framed in the great doorway with the winter light behind him. His eyes found Clara instantly and did not move again. Hazel eyes, her eyes in a stranger's weathered face, her own eyes looking back at her. The stranger's voice, when it came, was low and even, and it shook only on the last word. "Forgive the intrusion, your graces. My name is Edward Whitfield." A pause like a held breath 18 years long. "I have come to see my daughter." And in the ringing silence, while the card trembled on the silver tray and Clara's hand rose slowly to her mouth, and the locket burned against her skin, the butler, pale as his own gloves, leaned toward the Duke and murmured the second half of the message, the half that had come by courier an hour ahead of the carriage and was waiting, still sealed, in the study. Every mortgage on Blackwood land, every note, every debt of the estate held by the banks of London. As of 9 o'clock the previous morning, all of it, to the last farthing, had been quietly purchased by a single buyer. A gentleman lately arrived from Bombay. There are moments that 18 years of dreaming cannot prepare you for. Clara stood in the great hall of Blackwood Manor, staring at a silver-haired stranger with her own eyes set in his face, and found that she could not move. Her whole life she had imagined this, in the way children imagine impossible things, guiltily, the way one picks at a wound. He wasn't on the ship. It was all a mistake. One day there will be a knock at the door. Now the impossible thing stood in the doorway in a black coat, and Clara discovered that her legs would not carry her toward it. It was the impossible thing that moved first. Edward Whitfield crossed the marble floor, the same floor his daughter had scrubbed on her knees on her wedding night, though he did not know that yet, and God helped the house when he learned it and stopped before her, and looked down at her face the way a starving man looks at bread. "You were 4, he said quietly. "You had a wooden horse with one ear chewed off, and you would not sleep unless it was on the pillow. You called the sea the Big Wet. And when I carried you on my shoulders down to the harbor, you used to drum on my head and shout, 'Faster, Papa.'" Clara's breath left her in a sound that was not quite a sob. "I am told," Edward Whitfield continued, and his iron voice cracked down the middle like a frozen river, "that you kept the locket." She pulled it from beneath her collar with shaking hands and held it up, and the tall stranger in the black coat looked at the small gold circle he had fastened around a child's neck 18 years ago, and then Edward Whitfield, merchant prince of Bombay, terror of 3 exchanges, a man bankers whispered about, put his hands over his face and wept in front of the servants. Clara crossed the last 3 steps and was gathered into her father's arms, and for a long time in the great hall of Blackwood Manor there was no sound at all except a father and daughter, both talking at once, neither finishing a sentence, in the ancient broken language of the returned dead. Adrian stood apart and watched his wife come back to life, and his own eyes were burning. And yet, being a man who had recently learned to notice things, he noticed something else too. Whenever Edward Whitfield's gaze left his daughter's face and traveled around the great hall, the staircase, the portraits, the Blackwood arms carved above the doors, his eyes did not soften. They took inventory. The story came out that evening in the library in front of the fire with Lily sent to bed protesting, and Mrs. Hobbs stationed at the door as if guarding a hearing of state. Edward Whitfield sat straight-backed in his chair, a glass of untouched brandy at his side, and told it flatly, without decoration, like a man reading someone else's obituary. "They tell me you found the letters, Your Grace, the forgeries, so you know the beginning. Here is the rest. I knew about the fraud 3 days before the scandal broke. I found the false accounts in Amsterdam with my own name signed to them in a hand that was almost mine. Almost. I wrote to your father, my friend, my brother, in everything but blood, begging him to meet me quietly, telling him we had a serpent inside the company. I trusted the letter to the company's own courier system. He smiled thinly. You may imagine how that went. The serpent ran the courier system. 2 nights later, my warehouse office burned with all my proofs in it, and I received a visit not from your father, from a man I will not yet name, who explained to me pleasantly over my own port that the evidence against me was perfect, that the scandal would break within the week, that no court in England would take my word against the documents, and that I had one mercy left. There was a ship, the Meridian sailing Thursday for Lisbon. If I was on it, my wife and daughter would be left in peace, poor, disgraced, but alive. If I stayed to fight— Edward's eyes moved for 1 second to Clara. He described to me pleasantly over my own port what could happen to a woman and a small child in a city like London, accidents, fevers. He was very detailed. He enjoyed the details. So I ran. God forgive me, I thought I was buying time. I planned to reach Lisbon, gather proof from the Amsterdam end, and come back for my name and my family. I fastened my mother's locket around my daughter's neck, because it was the one thing I could not let them find in the house, and I boarded the Meridian. The fire cracked, nobody breathed. We were 2 days out when the fire started. In the hold in 3 places at once, I know, because I was awake and I smelled the lamp oil. Ships do not catch fire in 3 places at once, your grace. 31 men went into the water that night. The boats were rotten arranged, I have no doubt. I floated for a day and a night on a hatch cover in the Bay of Biscay, and I made an arrangement of my own with God while the sharks considered me. He picked up the brandy at last and drank it whole. A Portuguese fishing boat took me up. I had no papers, no money, no name. My name was poison anyway, and the man who burned that ship believed me dead. And a dead man, your grace, is the only man in England who is truly free. So I stayed dead. I worked my passage east. In Bombay I began as a clerk called Edmund Wheeler, and I will not weary you with 20 years of ledgers. It is enough to say that Rage is an excellent man of business. It never sleeps, never celebrates, never spends. By the time the crown came to me during the late troubles, quietly, needing ships and silver and a man who could move both without questions, I could name my price. My price was a full pardon in blank, a peerage, and the crown's silence about both until I chose to use them. He set down the glass and looked at them, and for the first time all evening something like grim amusement crossed his face. You are wondering about the carriage and the outriders. Allow me to complete the introduction. Edward Whitfield, 1st Earl of Wexcombe, by the grace of a grateful king. Which makes you, little bird, he turned to Clara, and his voice gentled by 1 degree, Lady Clara. An earl's daughter, an heiress to rather more than the Blackwood estate has ever been worth. Clara sat frozen. An hour ago she had been an orphan. It was too much, all of it, coming too fast, and through the roaring in her ears she heard Adrian ask, very quietly, the only question that mattered. Why now, my lord? 18 years dead, why come back now? And the temperature in the library dropped. Because 2 years ago, your grace, an inquiry agent walked into my Bombay office with a letter from your grandfather. Edward's voice went flat again, iron again. The old duke had found the forgeries, as you did. He wrote begging my forgiveness. I did not give it. I have none to give, not to anyone who bears the name over that door. Your family took my name, my country, my wife. She died of shame. Your grace, shame that belonged to your house and 18 years of my daughter's life. But the old man and I discovered we could be useful to one another. He wanted his conscience eased and his heir's soul saved. I wanted my daughter under a strong roof, safe, positioned, while I finished what 20 years of Rage had built. So we made a bargain, he and I, the will. He wrote his clause and died easier for it, poor fool. Edward rose from his chair and walked to the window, and his reflection in the dark glass looked out at the Blackwood Park with a stranger's cold eyes. He believed the marriage would be a redemption. I designed it as a siege. My daughter inside the walls, my money around them. And when everything that has ever borne the name Blackwood lies in pieces at my feet, the estate, the title, the man who wielded the pen, and the family that let him, then, your grace, my wife can rest. The silence that followed had edges. Papa, Clara stood slowly. Papa, look at me. It is not what you think. Adrian found the forgeries himself. He knelt at my door. Papa, I love him. Love. Edward did not turn from the window. Your mother loved me, little bird. I have seen what this family's neighborhood does to the women who love. No. He turned, and his face was the face from the exchanges, the face bankers whispered about. Here is what happens now. Tomorrow you come with me to London, to your own house, your own name, your own fortune, the life that was stolen from you. The annulment can be arranged quietly. I own the lawyers on both sides of it. You will want for nothing and fear no one, ever again. And if I refuse, then you may watch from inside these walls while I take them apart stone by stone. I hold every debt on this land, Clara, every note. I can be patient, or I can be quick, but I will not be stopped, not even by you. Something flickered behind the iron. He crushed it. I did not survive fire and water and 18 years of dying every night to leave my only child in the house of my enemies. They are not my enemy. Ask your servants, Edward said, and his voice for the first time rose and then dropped to something far worse than a shout. What happened in this house on your wedding night? Oh yes. I have been in England 11 days, little bird, and I have spent them the way I spend everything thoroughly. A bucket, a brush, a wedding gown ruined on this floor, while this man, his finger found Adrian and pointed like a pistol, went up those stairs to his bed. Clara went white. Adrian did not defend himself. He stood there and took her father's eyes on him and said only, "Everything you have heard is true. And there is nothing you can do to me, my lord, that I have not already sentenced myself to." "We shall see," said the Earl of Wexcombe, "about that." He gave them one night to decide. And it was in the small hours of that night, while Clara finally slept, exhausted by joy and grief, that Adrian came downstairs and found Edward Whitfield still awake in the library, and the two men who loved her had their private war. No one ever knew the whole of what was said. Mrs. Hobbs, listening shamelessly at the door, caught only pieces. Adrian's voice, low and urgent. "Poison in her glass in my own house, and I cannot yet prove whose hand. And as long as the man is free, every day she spends under my roof, she is a target beside me." And Edward's voice, cold. "Then you know what she needs, and you know it is not you." And then a long silence, and then Adrian again. So quietly the old woman barely caught it, in the voice of a man signing his own death warrant. "Take her then, take her tomorrow. I will sign whatever your lawyers put in front of me, annulment, renunciation, all of it, on one condition: she must never know why. If she knows I am doing this to protect her, she will fight it, and she will stay, and she will die here like—" His voice stopped. "She must believe I let her go. Do you understand me? Let her hate me. Hatred is cheap. I have lived on it for 18 years. She can spare 6 months of it. Just keep her alive, my lord, until I finish this." A silence. Then Edward Whitfield's voice, and for the first time it sounded almost respectful. "You would make her hate you to save her life. You made yourself dead for 18 years to save hers," said the Duke of Blackwood. "I am only doing what her family does." In the morning, the great black carriage stood on the drive, and the servants wept openly on the steps, and Lily had locked herself in the nursery and would speak to no one. And Clara stood in the hall in her traveling cloak, looking at her husband with disbelief, still fighting hope in her face. Because surely he would explain, surely there was a plan, surely last night's cold, careful stranger who had handed her into her father's keeping for a time, while matters are settled, would break now at the last moment and become Adrian again. "So," she said, and her voice failed and she tried again. "So it's true, then. You signed the papers, just sign them." "It is better this way," said the stranger with her husband's face. His eyes were fixed on a point slightly above her shoulder. "Your father can give you what I cannot. Your position, your safety, your—" "Say my name." His jaw tightened. He said nothing. "You knelt at my door," she whispered. "You said, 'Adrian, look at me.' You said you would spend your asterisk life." "The carriage is waiting, Lady Clara." Lady Clara, not her name. Her title, her new, correct, annulled title. It landed like a slap, exactly as he had built it to, and he watched the hope die in her eyes with his hands folded behind his back so that she could not see them shaking. Clara drew herself up. She did not weep. She had never once let this house see her weep for herself, and she would not begin at the end. She looked at him for a long, last moment, the way one memorizes something before a fire takes it. "My whole life," she said quietly, "people have told me what I am, a thief's daughter, a condition in a will, a servant duchess, and I never believed any of them, not one, because I knew what I was better than they did." She pulled her hood up against the winter. "But you, Adrian, you I believed." She turned and walked out of Blackwood Manor. Down the steps her wedding gown had once trailed up, past the weeping servants, and into the black carriage. And Edward Whitfield, watching from beside the carriage door, looked back once at the man standing motionless in the doorway of his enemy's house. What Edward saw in that man's face, he never told a living soul. But it is recorded that the Earl of Wexcombe, scourge of 3 exchanges, paused with his hand on the carriage door and gave the Duke of Blackwood a single, slow nod. The nod one soldier gives another across a battlefield. Then the door closed, the wheels bit the gravel, and the carriage carried Clara away down the long avenue. While behind a nursery window a little girl beat her fists against the glass, and in the doorway a man watched everything he loved grow smaller and smaller in the winter light, and did not permit himself to fall until the carriage was gone. London that winter had a new sensation, and her name was Lady Clara Whitfield. The story ran through the drawing rooms like fire through dry grass. The dead man returned from the East with half the wealth of India, the secret earldom, the daughter raised in poverty and now dressed by the finest houses in Paris. And deliciously, scandalously, the asterisk annulment asterisk. The ragged duchess who had scrubbed floors at Blackwood was suddenly the greatest heiress in England, and the same great ladies who had frozen her out at the winter ball now fought like cats for a card to the Earl of Wexcombe's table. Clara received them all with perfect, distant courtesy, in a mansion on Grosvenor Square with 40 rooms and no home in it anywhere. Her father gave her everything: gowns, jewels, carriages, a French maid, an Italian singing master, a box at the opera. He was trying, in his iron, ruined way, he was trying to give her back 18 years in 18 weeks, and there were moments, whole evenings by the fire, when she caught sight of the father under the Earl and loved him helplessly. But every night alone, Clara sat at her window looking north and held the locket and fought the same war against the same memory. A man's eyes fixed on a point above her shoulder. "The carriage is waiting, Lady Clara." She had stopped weeping by the second week. What remained was worse than weeping. It was arithmetic, the endless, circling arithmetic of the abandoned. "He knelt at my door." He could not have pretended that. But then he signed. But then his hands, I saw his hands, they were no. He signed. He let me go. "Believe what people do, not what you wish." He signed. The only warmth came in small, smuggled envelopes, addressed in a careful child's hand, arriving by means no one questioned too closely. Mrs. Hobbs had a niece in London, and the Royal Mail asks no questions. "Dear Clara, Aunt Agatha says I must call you Lady Clara now, but I shan't. The house is horrid. Nobody laughs. Adrian sits in grandfather's study all night with papers and he has gone thin, and once I found him asleep at the desk holding something, and it was your hair ribbon, the gray one you lost. I took it back for evidence. When are you coming home? It is your home. I don't care what the lawyers say, sisters are not annulable. Your Lily. Clara read that letter until it fell apart at the folds, and the arithmetic wavered. He sits all night with what papers? And then steadied again, crueler than before. You are doing it again. Hoping. Believe what people do. What people were doing that winter was watching the house of Blackwood die. It was done with terrifying quietness. No dramatics, no announcements, just a great financial hand closing, one finger at a time. In January, the notes on the eastern farms were called in. In February, the timber contracts collapsed, and the London bank that had served the dukedom for a century regretted that it could no longer extend the customary facilities. Blackwood grain rotted at market because buyers had been quietly warned off. Blackwood credit died in the city the way the Whitfield name had once died, by whisper, by raised eyebrow, by doors that were never slammed, only softly, permanently closed. Society understood perfectly and said so behind its fans. The Earl was avenging his daughter. And what did the ruined Duke do? Nothing. Asterisk, my dear. No countersuits, no appeals to old friends, not one word in his own defense. He sold his hunters. He sold the London house. They say he dismissed half the servants with a year's wages paid from the sale of his mother's sapphires. He must be guilty of something, society concluded comfortably. Silent men always are. But the Duke of Blackwood was not silent because he was guilty. He was silent because he was busy. Night after night, in the cold study with the broken drawer, Adrian was building a case, and every road in it ran through the same choice. The choice he had been circling for weeks, like a man circling a fire he must eventually walk into. He could prove now most of it. He had found the employment agency's ledger and traced the nameless footman of the ball to a lodging house in Shadwell, and from the footman bought once and bought cheap, poison being a trade with no loyalty in it, a sworn statement naming the gentleman who had hired him, silver-haired, pale-eyed, paying in old coin. He had the lock picks, witnessed by Mrs. Hobbs. He had the forged letters and the true ones, and the flicked T's. And best of all, he had found, in 3 weeks of dredging the worst streets in London with a purse in one hand, a dying old man in a Spitalfields garret. A master forger, lungs gone, soul heavy, who looked at the letters Adrian laid on his blanket and wept and said, 18 years I've waited for somebody to come about them letters, and gave a full confession before a magistrate's clerk. The commission, the payment, the client, the name. And there it was, the fire he had to walk into. Because the name was Blackwood too. To use any of it was to use all of it. There was no version of the truth in which Edward Whitfield rose innocent, and the family stayed clean. The same testimony that cleared the Whitfield name convicted a Blackwood of forgery, of arson, of 31 men drowned in the Bay of Biscay, of a poisoned glass of wine. And Adrian was now grimly certain, though he could never prove it, of an old man's heart stopping conveniently in his sleep 11 days after writing I begin to see by whom. 300 years of the name over that door, ending not in ruin. Ruin was survivable. Ruin was even noble, but in the felon's dock. Lily's name, his father's name, his own. His grandfather had faced the same fire, and had flinched, and had died leaving a riddle in a drawer instead of a testimony in a court. My proud fool of a grandson. Adrian looked at the portrait of the old Duke above the cold hearth for a long moment. No, sir, he said aloud to the empty study. Not this time. We buried an innocent man's name to save our own. I find the price of the name has been paid by the wrong family long enough. On the first Monday of March, the Duke of Blackwood walked into the chambers of the Crown Prosecutor with a leather case containing every document, every statement, every letter, the complete and unabridged destruction of his own house, and laid it on the desk and said, I wish to lay information against Lord Rupert Blackwood. The charges will include forgery, arson on the high seas, and murder. I am aware of what this does to my family. Begin." The Crown prosecutor read for 2 hours while the Duke sat motionless. At the end, the old lawyer took off his spectacles and looked at the young man across the desk with something close to awe. "Your Grace, you understand that you are handing me the axe for your own family tree." "I am handing you," said Adrian, "the truth 18 years late. The tree can take its chances." Word travels in London. It travels fastest of all along the private channels of powerful men, and by Wednesday, 2 men knew that the axe had begun to swing. The first was Edward Whitfield, who received the news from one of his purchased lawyers, listened without expression, dismissed the man, and then stood alone at his study window for a very long time. On his desk lay his own weapon, polished and ready, the dossier he had built across 18 years, waiting only for the moment of total ruin to be driven home. He had planned to be the one. He had earned the right to be the one. And the boy, the son of the house that destroyed him, the man who had scorned his daughter and then given her up, the boy had walked in first and paid for the blow with his own name. "You made yourself dead for 18 years to save hers," the boy had said that night in the library. "I am only doing what her family does." Edward Whitfield looked at his dossier and at the winter sky and discovered that hatred, after 18 years of perfect service, had begun, infinitesimally, to leak. The second man who learned of it was Lord Rupert. Understand this about cornered creatures. The rat runs, the wolf attacks, but the spider that has sat at the center of a web for 18 years, the spider does neither. It calculates. Rupert stood in his club with the letter of warning burning in his pocket, and his face showed nothing at all. And behind the pale eyes the great cold engine turned over the problem one final time. Flight was ruin. Trial was death. The forger's confession alone would hang him. Therefore the evidence must be surrendered, bought, or burned. And the evidence was now in the hands of the Crown, of the Duke, and of the Earl, untouchable, all of it. But there existed, still, one piece of evidence outside the vaults in the chambers. One small golden piece that he had failed to find at midnight behind a locked door, that had swung into the lamplight of the great hall and stopped his heart. The oldest evidence. The first evidence. The thing that had started it all 18 years ago, before the letters, before the fire, the thing whose existence perhaps not even Whitfield fully understood. Around the neck of a girl. And the beautiful, the symmetrical thing, the thing that made the pale eyes glitter at last in the light of the club fire, was that the girl was also the one lever left on earth that would move both of them. The avenging father, the self-destroying nephew, 2 men who had surrendered every protection, who could no longer be bought or frightened for themselves. For themselves. "Another brandy, my lord," murmured the club servant. "No," said Lord Rupert pleasantly, taking up his gloves. "No, I find I have a journey to arrange." The letter reached Grosvenor Square on Friday, by the evening post, in a careful child's hand on the familiar cheap paper, and Clara's heart turned over at the sight of it before she had read a word. "Dear Clara, please come. Adrian is hurt. He was thrown from Caesar on the ice on the North Road, and the doctor's face is grave, and he will not stop saying your name. Aunt Agatha says I must not write to you, but Mrs. Hobbs is smuggling this. Please come quick, and please tell nobody. If the lawyers find out you came, they will make trouble about the annulment. Mr. Grimsby said so. The carriage will wait at the Angel at Islington at 9 tonight. Our coachman John will find you. Come alone. Your Lily." Long afterward, Clara would understand everything that was wrong with that letter. That Lily spelled smuggling correctly and always had, for she was vain about her spelling. That John Coachman had been dismissed with the others in February. That no child says the doctor's face is grave. That the hand was perfect, and the T*S, the T's lay flat as dead men, and she of all people should have. But that was afterward. On Friday evening there was only a girl who had spent 3 months believing what people do instead of what she hoped, reading "He will not stop saying your name," and every gate in her heart gave way at once. The arithmetic burned to nothing. He was hurt. He was asking for her. Nothing else on the surface of the earth was real. She told her father she was dining with the Countess of Marsh. She took the locket, a traveling cloak, and no maid. At 9 o'clock in the courtyard of the Angel at Islington, a respectful man she did not know touched his hat and said, "Lady Clara." "This way, my lady, his Grace's carriage." And she was inside with the door shut and the wheels moving before she registered that the blinds were nailed down. "We must hurry," she said to the dark. "How bad is he? Tell me the truth." From the corner of the carriage, pleasantly, a voice that was not a coachman's voice replied, "The truth, my dear. The truth is that your husband is in perfect health, a condition I confess I intend to be temporary." A small lamp was unshuttered, and in its glow, silver-haired and smiling, comfortable as a spider at the center of a web, with a pistol resting on his knee as casually as another man's snuff-box, sat Lord Rupert. "Now then, Lady Clara," he said, as the carriage swung north into the dark, gathering speed. "You and I are going to take a little journey into the past, and along the way, you are going to tell me everything you know about that charming trinket around your neck, and precisely what your father has been waiting 18 years to do with it." The carriage ran north through the dark for 5 hours, and Lord Rupert talked. He talked the way a man talks when he has kept silence for 18 years and knows, with a connoisseur's certainty, that his audience will never repeat a word. The pistol on his knee said why. And Clara, pressed into the corner with her cloak drawn tight, did the only thing left to her. She listened, and she learned, and she watched for her moment. "You are quiet, my dear. Good. Your father was clever too at the beginning before he became clever at *me, which was his mistake. Do you know what your father's crime was, Lady Clara? He checked the accounts. 20 years of partnership, mountains of money moving through a dozen ports, and no one ever checked. Why would they, between brothers? And then one wet October your father sat down in Amsterdam with the ledgers and a lamp." The pale eyes glittered in the swaying light. "Some men are ruined by greed. I was very nearly ruined by your father's tidiness." "So the fraud was yours," Clara said quietly. "From the start. You were robbing the company and he caught you, and instead of the dock you gave them him." "I gave them a story, Rupert corrected, with the mild irritation of a craftsman undervalued. "Stories need villains. The villain needed a hand. Hands can be learned. 18 months I practiced his, my dear. Do you know what that is? 18 months of another man's alphabet. Until I could write his name more truly than he wrote it himself." And Clara, cold to the bone, 5 hours captive in the dark, felt something drop into place with an almost audible click. The letter in her pocket. "Come alone. Your Lily." The perfect childish hand. The flat, dead, lying *S. "The letter tonight," she said, "and the letters 18 years ago, the same pen." Rupert inclined his head, pleased, like a master acknowledging a promising pupil. "The same pen. It has been," he sighed, "a versatile career." Dawn was a gray thread in the east when the carriage finally lurched off the road and up an overgrown track and stopped. Rupert handed her down with grotesque courtesy. The coachman, a blank-faced brute, kept a grip on her arm, and Clara looked up at their destination and felt the cold go deeper than the wind. A hunting lodge, alone in a clearing in a black wood. Old, shuttered, dead, the garden swallowed by briars, the windows blind, and along one wing, still visible after all the years, the long dark stain of an old burning that no rain had ever fully washed away. "You'll forgive the accommodation," Rupert said, unlocking the door with a key he owned far too readily. The family stopped using it some years ago. Sentiment, this way. Inside, dust, mouse-riddled furniture under sheets, and cold that had been undisturbed for years. The coachman set a single lamp on the table and Rupert placed a chair for her, placed it precisely in the center of the room like a stage manager, and stood regarding her with his head tilted. "Do you know where you are, Lady Clara?" "An old lodge on Blackwood Land." "You are," said Rupert, "in the room where my brother and his wife died." The lamp flame shivered. Clara went very still. "Oh, yes." He strolled to the shuttered window, trailing a glove through the dust. 18 years ago, the winter after your father's regrettable scandal, his regrettable shipwreck. My brother the Duke took it all so hard, you see. Grief is natural, grief passes. But my brother's grief began to ask questions. He had known your father 30 years. Men do not change their souls at 50, he kept saying. He came out here that January to this quiet lodge to be alone with the papers. He was a slow reader, my brother, but thorough, like your father, tidy. Rupert turned from the window, and for the first time that night the pleasantness had gone out of his face entirely, leaving something bare and lipless underneath. He wrote to me that he had found an irregularity in the letters. An irregularity. He wished to consult me, of all the ironies, before taking it to the lawyers. His Duchess drove out to join him for the night. "You burned it," Clara whispered. "With them inside, Adrian's mother and father, your own brother." "A lamp overturned so easily in an old wooden house," said Rupert. "Ask anyone, ask the inquest." He drew out his watch, glanced at it, and was pleasant again, which was worse. "And now, my dear, the night's business, for we are pressed for time. The locket, take it off." Clara's hand rose to her throat. 18 years of a promise. Never take it off, little bird. "No." "Madam, the request was a courtesy." The pistol was suddenly no longer casual. "The locket, now." There are moments to fight and moments to think. And Clara, who had survived a lifetime by knowing which was which, slowly unfastened the clasp and dropped the small gold circle into his outstretched glove. What happened next she would remember all her life. Rupert carried it to the lamp like a priest carrying a relic, pressed it open, ignored utterly the engraved crest that Clara had puzzled over for 18 years. He knew it already, she realized. He knew this locket before I was born, and drew from his pocket a thin knife and slid the point beneath the engraved plate itself. The plate lifted. Underneath, in a cavity a coin's width, sealed all these years behind her father's mother's coat of arms, lay a whisper-thin fold of paper. 18 years, Rupert breathed. He was not talking to her anymore. He was not talking to anyone. "I took his house apart to the laths. I had the grave watched, the empty grave, as it proves. I burned this lodge, I burned the warehouse, I burned the ship, and all of it was around a child's neck in a Hertfordshire village." He unfolded the paper with fingers that were not quite steady. And Clara, from her chair in the center of the room, saw what 18 years of fires had been lit to destroy. A single sheet, covered edge to edge in one repeated line, Edward Whitfield, Edward Whitfield, Edward Whitfield. A signature practiced over and over, growing truer with every row, like a monster learning to wear a face. And at the bottom, in the same hand at last relaxed into its own shape, a banker's draft instruction, and a signature that was not Whitfield at all. Her father had found the forger's rehearsal sheet, all those years ago, had understood in one glance what it meant and what it made him, and, with the serpent already coiled around his house, had hidden it in the one place no man would think to look and no thief could take without violence. Around the neck of a 4-year-old girl, sealed behind his dead mother's crest, guarded by a child's promise. "One day you will understand everything." "Papa," Clara whispered to the cold room, "I understand." "Touching," said Rupert, and held the paper to the lamp flame. It caught, flared, curled, 18 years of proof becoming a bright ribbon of nothing, and he dropped it on the stone hearth and watched it die, and something in his shoulders unlocked that had been locked for 2 decades. Then he took up his hat. "Difficulty, of course," he said, conversational again, moving toward the door where the coachman waited, "is that you have now heard the whole of it, and that your husband has been so very busy with prosecutors and your father with dossiers, testimony everywhere. But juries, my dear, are simple creatures. They believe documents, and the documents are ash, and they believe grief." He paused in the doorway and looked back at her and tilted his head and smiled his cold smile for the last time. A ruined duke's runaway wife, estranged from a vengeful father, wandering at night to the very lodge where her husband's parents perished, pilgrimage perhaps, guilt, who can say? And a lamp overturned so easily in an old wooden house. Ask anyone, ask the inquest. History, Lady Clara, does not repeat itself. I repeat it. Good night. The door closed. The bolt shot home like a gunshot. And through the shutters, a moment later, came the sound of the lamp bursting against the outside of the wooden wall, and then the first bright crackle, and the first gray finger of smoke curling under the door. They had found her gone at midnight. The Countess of Marsh, applied to by a footman, had seen no one. The Earl of Wexcombe had gone up to his daughter's rooms himself, 2 stairs at a time, and found the wardrobe undisturbed, the jewels untouched, and on the writing desk, unfolded, a letter in a careful child's hand. Edward Whitfield read it once. He read every word once, the way he read contracts, and by the second sentence the room had gone soundless around him, because 18 months of another man's alphabet works both ways. No man alive knew that pen's habits better than the man it had destroyed. The flat T's. His hands, which had not trembled since the Bay of Biscay, trembled now. "Horses," he said, "every man in the house, and send my carriage ahead to Blackwood. No carriage, horses." He was over 60. He rode that night like the king's own courier, 4 hours in the iron dark with 6 armed grooms strung out behind him, and hammered on the doors of his enemy's house at 4 in the morning. And when the ruined duke came down with a candle, dressed, haggard, awake, because the wretched man plainly never slept, Edward Whitfield held out the forged letter and said only, "He has her." He never afterward forgot the transformation he watched then. He had ruined this man for months, stripped his lands, his credit, his name, and Blackwood had taken it all with his head high and his mouth shut. Now, reading a forged child's scrawl by candlelight, the Duke aged 5 years in 5 seconds, and then burned 10 off again, and became something Edward recognized from harbor knife fights 40 years gone. "The lodge," Adrian said. "The old hunting lodge, North Wood. It's where he was already moving, shouting up the stairwell for boots and pistols. It's where it began. He'll want God, he'll want the cemetery, Mrs. Hobbs. Wake Thomas, send the stable boy to the magistrate at Wexford Cross. The Crown's men are lodged there with the warrant. Tell them the North Lodge. Tell them to bring everyone." The 2 men rode out of the gate side by side, the Duke and the Earl, the ruiner and the ruined, and neither of them spoke a word for 11 miles, and their horses' breath smoked in the black air. And somewhere in the 12th mile, over the trees, they saw the sky begin to turn orange. The lodge was a torch. The fire had taken the whole west wall and the roof above it. Smoke poured through the shutter seams as though the house itself were breathing its last. Rupert's carriage stood abandoned at the wood's edge. The coachman had bolted at the sight of 6 armed riders. Rupert himself, caught in the open halfway to it, froze in the orange light like a spider surprised on a wall. Adrian did not even look at him. He came off his horse at full gallop, hit the ground running, and took the burning door with his shoulder twice, while behind him Edward's grooms fell on Rupert, and Edward himself, sliding from the saddle with his heart bursting, heard the sound that took 20 years off his life. From inside the fire, thin above the roar, his child's voice calling, not calling for help, calling a name, Adrian. The door gave. The Duke of Blackwood went into the fire. What Edward Whitfield saw next, he described only once years later to his grandchildren, and never again because he could not do it without weeping. The doorway of the burning lodge, a rectangle of solid flame, and then out of it, impossibly, a man walking, wrapped in his own smoking greatcoat, with a woman in his arms and his back on fire. They rolled him in the frozen mud. They beat the flames off him with their coats and their hands. And Clara, scorched, gasping, alive, alive, crawled to where he lay face down in the mud that was hissing around him, and took his blistered face in both her hands, and the first thing her ruined voice managed was, "You came, you the letter, I thought you let me go." And Adrian, half-conscious, his back a ruin, smiled at her with absolute contentment, as if they were lying in a summer meadow, and whispered, "Never. Ask your father," and fainted. Behind them, held on his knees in the firelight between two grooms, Lord Rupert began at last to talk, really talk, hemorrhage talk, because the Crown's men were cresting the rise with the magistrate and the wagons, and 18 years of perfect calculation had ended in mud and orange light, and spiders, when the web finally tears, have nothing at the center but fear. He talked about the accounts and the letters. He talked about the ship. He talked about his brother, and the lamp, and this lodge, while the magistrate's clerk wrote by firelight as fast as his hand could drive, and the burning house roared witness behind him. Edward Whitfield stood over him and listened to the confession he had waited 18 years to hear, his acquittal, his resurrection, his wife's peace, everything, and found he could not attend to it. He kept turning to look at the man in the mud instead. His enemy's son, burned half to death for the daughter of the man whose name he'd been raised to curse. "My lord," the magistrate called through the smoke, holding up the scrawled confession. "My lord, it is everything. Your name, do you understand me, my lord? Your name is clean." "Yes," said Edward Whitfield, not turning around. He was on his knees in the mud by then, helping Clara hold a wounded man's head out of the wet, with his coat bundled under it, as tenderly as if the man were his own. "Yes, I begin to think it may be." Adrian did not wake that day, nor the next, nor the next. The doctors came from London again, different doctors, humbler ones, Dr. Harlow among them, who took one look at the woman keeping vigil at the bedside and said nothing whatever about kitchen remedies. The burns were grave. The fever, when it came, was worse. For 3 days and 3 nights the Duke of Blackwood lay on his face in the great bed at the manor and fought for his life. And Clara, who had done this before, did what she did. Honey and lint for the burns, willow bark, clean cold air, and her voice, hour after hour, reading, talking, singing the small village songs, holding onto him with it like a rope. Lily sat on the other side of the bed and held his hand, and informed him regularly that he was not permitted to die, as brothers were not annihilable either. And on the 4th morning at first light, Clara, asleep in her chair with her head fallen against the mattress, woke to a sensation she could not at first name. Something was touching her hair, weakly, clumsily, deliberately. She lifted her head. Gray eyes, open, clouded with pain and fever and absolutely clear underneath, were watching her. The Duke of Blackwood looked at his wife for a long moment, at her singed hair and her bandaged hands and her face, which held everything. And when his voice came, it was a burned whisper, but it did not shake. "Are you still my wife? Are you still my wife?" Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the gray eyes holding hers, at the bandaged hands, at the man who had walked into fire. And then, because she had earned it, she smiled through her tears and gave him the truth. "No," she said, "legally. No, my father's lawyers were monstrously thorough. There's a document in London with your signature on it and everything. I am, at present, no one's wife at all." Adrian closed his eyes as if gathering strength. Then, moving 1 inch at a time, wincing all the way, The Duke of Blackwood pulled his burned right hand free of the coverlet and held it out to her, palm up, exactly as he had done across a crowded ballroom a lifetime ago. "Then it appears, madam," he whispered, "that I must court you properly this time. From the beginning, flowers, poetry. I warn you, my poetry is execrable." "Adrian." "But my flowers are very fine. We have 4 gardeners, 3. I could no longer pay the 4th. "Adrian," laughing and weeping at once, she laid her hand in his open palm, featherlight on the bandages. "Yes." "I have not asked anything yet." "You have been asking since the winter garden," said Clara. "The answer has been yes the whole time." It was, of course, not so simple. Nothing in that family was ever simple. Because there was a father. The confrontation everyone at Blackwood Manor dreaded came in April, when Adrian could finally stand and walk unaided. Edward Whitfield had remained through the whole convalescence, theoretically at the inn at Wexford Cross, in practice haunting the manor daily, growling at doctors, playing chess with Lily, who beat him twice, to his outraged delight, and pointedly not discussing the future with anyone. The whole house knew the arithmetic. The annulment stood. The Earl's fortune stood. The Earl's opinion of the House of Blackwood publicly, formally, also still stood. And one grey morning the servants watched the Duke of Blackwood, leaning on a cane, walk into the library where the Earl of Wexcombe sat reading, and close the door behind him. Mrs. Hobbs, for once in her life, was too dignified to listen at the door. She sent Betsy. "He asked him," Betsy reported breathlessly to the servants' hall, eyes like saucers. "Straight out, standing up on his cane like it was a court-martial. He said, 'My lord, I have no fortune left, no credit, and a name your family has every right to curse. I have nothing to offer your daughter but the rest of my life, which is hers already and has been, I think, since the night she saved my sister. I am asking for your blessing. I am not asking for your forgiveness, I know better. But I will spend the next 40 years earning it, whether you grant it or not.'" The servants' hall was silent as a church. "And the Earl?" demanded the cook. "What did the Earl say?" "That's the thing," said Betsy. "He didn't say nothing, not for the longest time. He just got up and went to the window and stood there with his back turned. And then he said real quiet, I almost didn't hear, he said, 18 years I kept myself alive on one thing, hatred. It is a food, you know. A man can live on it entire." And then he turned round and looked at his Grace and said, "And then my daughter's husband burned half the skin off his back rather than let her breathe smoke, and I find the larder empty, sir. I find I am too old to restock it." "And then," said the entire servants' hall. Betsy wiped her eyes with her apron. "Then he said, 'You will not spend 40 years earning my forgiveness, boy. You earned it on your knees in the mud at the North Lodge. I watched you do it. What you will spend 40 years doing is making her laugh. She has 18 years of laughing owed to her, and you will pay that debt before you pay me 1 farthing of any other.' And then," Betsy's voice wobbled entirely, "then his Grace bowed his head, and the Earl crossed the room and embraced him, careful-like. On account of the burns. It is recorded that not one person in the servants' hall of Blackwood Manor got any work done for the rest of that morning. Lord Rupert Blackwood was tried at the summer assizes. It lasted 4 days, and the newspapers printed nothing else. The forger's deathbed confession, the footman from Shadwell, the shipping records, the magistrate's clerk reading in a dead-quiet courtroom, the confession scrawled by firelight in the mud while a house burned behind him. The prisoner, they wrote, listened to it all with perfect composure, like a man attending someone else's trial, and was composed still when the judge put on the black cap. Justice in that century was not slow. By August it was done, and the name went into the newspapers one last time, and then, by unspoken agreement of an entire county, was simply never said again. In the great hall of Blackwood Manor there had once been a portrait. There was now a very good tapestry, and if visitors noticed the rectangle of unfaded paneling behind it, they were too polite to say so. What the newspapers savored far longer was the other story, the resurrection. The Crown's formal proclamation of Edward Whitfield's innocence, read at the Royal Exchange. The old verdict struck from the record, and the detail that made every reader in England put down the paper and stare out the window. 18 years later, at the church in a small Hertfordshire village, a marble stone was raised at last over the grave of a woman who had died of borrowed shame, Sarah Whitfield. Wronged in life, righted before God, her name is clean. Her husband stood at that grave alone for one whole morning, and what he said to her, no one ever knew and everyone knew. They were married in September, on a blue and gold morning, in the same chapel as before. Nothing else was the same. The first wedding had held 300 of society's finest, whispering behind fans. The second held perhaps 60 souls, and the front pews, the front pews, by the bride's absolute command, printed on the cards, non-negotiable, were filled with the servants of Blackwood Manor in their Sunday best. The cook, weeping steadily from the opening hymn, old Thomas, ramrod straight in a new coat, Betsy, whose sharp eyes had ruined themselves embroidering silver stars and who now wore spectacles bought by a duchess. And at the very front, in black silk that the bride had ordered from Paris in secret, Mrs. Hobbs, who had carried tea to a girl's scrubbing marble at 2 o'clock in the morning, and who now sat in the place reserved in every wedding for the mother. Lily, 9 going on 40, was maid of honor, and conducted herself with tremendous state for 11 whole minutes before abandoning her post to sit on the Earl of Wexcombe's knee. The bride wore midnight blue silk sewn with tiny silver stars. "White I wore for strangers," she had said. "For my family, I'll wear my armor and one small golden locket," and she came down the aisle on her father's arm. Edward Whitfield, Earl of Wexcombe, terror of 3 exchanges, walked his daughter to her bridegroom with his iron face perfectly composed, and tears running down it the entire way, disdaining to acknowledge them, daring anyone present to acknowledge them, while the entire congregation wept with him out of simple self-defense. At the altar rail he placed her hand in the Duke's, and held both their hands a moment in his weathered brown ones. "Little bird," he said quietly, "the last time a man made promises to you in this chapel, your father was not here to hold him to them." He looked at Adrian, and one corner of the iron mouth bent. "He is here now. Proceed." And when the register was signed, the Earl presented his wedding gift, a plain wooden box which the bride opened before the whole company. Inside, in neat banded stacks, lay every mortgage, every note, every debt of the Blackwood estate, the whole golden noose, 18 months in the tying. "Your dowry," said Edward Whitfield. "Do as you please with it, though I am told," he added deadpan, "that the drawing-room fire draws exceptionally well." They burned the notes that evening, the whole wedding party together, feeding them to the flames like festival papers while Lily danced, and the Countess of Marsh, who had been invited for luck, fainted with pure satisfaction into the arms of a footman who was expecting it, and the servants drank champagne in the great hall with the quality, because the bride had made that a printed instruction too. It was very late, past midnight, when the last guest was seen off, and the last candle in the great hall stood guttering. Clara came down the marble staircase in her dressing gown, looking for her husband, and found the great hall empty and the ballroom doors standing open, and stopped. The ballroom was lit by a single branch of candles, and in the middle of that vast, gleaming floor, the floor knelt the Duke of Blackwood in his shirt-sleeves on his wedding night. Beside him stood a wooden bucket. In his hands was a scrubbing brush. "Adrian," her voice caught between laughing and breaking, "what on earth?" "1 year ago," he said, not rising, "a man knelt a woman down on this floor on this night in her wedding gown and told her, 'You will learn what you are in this house.' He looked up at her across the candlelight and his eyes were shining. He was right, you know. That's the terrible thing. Someone in this marriage did learn on this floor exactly what they were. It simply wasn't you. He dipped the brush in the water and set it to the marble, and scrubbed one long, deliberate, ridiculous stroke. I have consulted Mrs. Hobbs, he went on conversationally scrubbing, while Clara pressed both hands to her mouth, who informs me this floor takes 4 hours properly done. I intend to do it properly. You are welcome to retire, madam, or to sit on the stairs and supervise, which I'm told is traditional for the aristocracy. He got no further, because his wife had crossed the ballroom, and knelt down on the marble in front of him in her dressing gown on her wedding night, and taken his face in her hands. "You'll ruin your bandages, you impossible man," she whispered. "They came off Tuesday. Clara, I need to say it, once here on this floor where I said the other thing." His voice dropped and the mockery went out of it, and what was left was bare. "You will learn what you are in this house. So learn it. You are the reason this house is standing. You are the best thing my family ever did, and we did it by accident and against our own will, and 18 years of scheming by wicked men could not prevent it. You are my wife twice over, my sister's mother in everything but blood, and the finest soul I will ever meet on this earth. That is what you are in this house." He turned his head and kissed her palm. "And what I am in this house, madam, is a man who counts it the honor of his life to kneel on this particular floor." Clara looked at him, at the brush, the bucket, the candles, the absurd, magnificent, burned and mended man on his knees on the marble. And then she reached past him, rolled back the sleeve of her dressing gown, and picked up a second brush that she had somehow known, walking down those stairs, would be waiting there. 4 hours, Mrs. Hobbs says. She dipped it in the water. Then we had better do it together. That's rather the point of the institution, I'm told. And that is how the servants of Blackwood Manor, every one of whom, by ancient instinct, had found some reason to pass the ballroom doors that night, would tell the story ever after down the years, to their children and their grandchildren, and anyone in the village who would sit still for it. How on a September midnight they saw the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood, on their wedding night, scrubbing the great ballroom floor side by candlelight, laughing so helplessly they could barely work, and how the sound of it carried up the marble staircase and along the corridors and through the whole great house, which had waited 18 years to hear it. And how old Mrs. Hobbs stood in the doorway with her candle for a long, long time, watching them, before she turned away at last and said, to nobody, in the voice of a woman closing an account book, "There now, there's the house I promised her mother." 5 years later, on a golden June afternoon, 5 years later, Blackwood Manor stood with every window open to the summer, and the sound coming out of those windows would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known the house in the old days. The sound was shrieking, specifically the shrieking of a 4-year-old boy being chased across the south lawn by his grandfather. "The Pirate King is coming," roared Edward Whitfield, Earl of Wexcombe, 68 years old, terror of 3 exchanges, on all fours in the grass with a little girl of 3 riding on his back and drumming on his silver head with both hands. "The Pirate King shows no mercy." "Faster, Grandpapa," commanded the small tyrant on his back. "Faster." And Edward Whitfield closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, because some words, coming down through the years in a child's voice, go straight through a man like sunlight through glass. And then he laughed and went faster. From the terrace, the Duchess of Blackwood watched the chaos with one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, where the third small Blackwood was napping ahead of a September arrival. 5 years had given Clara some silver threads of her own, laugh lines at her eyes, and hair well past her shoulders again, though she was known to say she'd cut it off tomorrow without blinking, having once received an excellent price. "Ned, Sarah, Grandpapa is an old man," she called, entirely without conviction. "Grandpapa," said her father with dignity from the grass, "is a *Pirate King, Madam and pirate kings do not age. They season. Little Ned Edward Adrian, Marquis of something or other that nobody in the family could be bothered to use, came pelting up the terrace steps and collided with his mother's skirts. He was dark like his father and stubborn like both grandfathers, and he was clutching, as he clutched at all hours, a small wooden horse with one ear chewed off. The horse had arrived on his second birthday in a plain box from Grosvenor Square. Clara had opened the box and gone very still, and then quietly left the room for a while. Her father had gone all the way to a toymaker in a Hertfordshire village to have it made from memory. It was, he maintained, a perfectly ordinary gift, and he would thank everyone to stop making a fuss. Sarah came next, golden-haired, dimpled, catastrophic, dragged along by her Aunt Lily, who at 14 was tall, sharp-tongued, beautiful in a way that was already causing preliminary despair among the young men of the county, and who remained in all things her sister-in-law's lieutenant. "Your daughter," Lily announced, "has been eating soil again. She says it's what pirates eat. I feel she gets her information from an unreliable source." She glared at the lawn, where the unreliable source was now lying flat on his back in the grass, defeated, while a 3-year-old stood on his chest in triumph. Inside, the house hummed. The estate had long since been rebuilt, half by good management and half by the terrifying joint attentions of a duke and an earl who between them now owned, as the city said, everything between London and the weather. The fourth gardener had been rehired, with 3 friends. Betsy was lady's maid now, and engaged to the new steward. Old Thomas had retired to the Gate Lodge, where he told outrageously improved versions of the whole story to travelers. And Mrs. Hobbs ruled on. She was past 70 and had surrendered nothing. She had been offered a cottage and a pension, and had responded by rearranging the linen room and hiring 2 new maids. It was universally understood that she was waiting to see the 3rd baby christened, and after that the 4th, and that Death himself would be required to make an appointment through her, in writing, and would be told to wipe his feet. That June afternoon there were visitors, a young viscountess, newly married, being given the tour, trailing through the great rooms with wide eyes. In the ballroom she stopped. The room blazed with summer light. Acres of marble polished to a mirror, the great chandelier, the tall windows open to the roses. But what had stopped the young visitor was none of that. It was a small case of glass and gilt, mounted on the wall in the place of honor where another house would have hung a masterpiece or a sword taken in battle. Inside the case on dark blue velvet lay a plain wooden scrubbing brush, old, worn, its bristles bent flat with hard use. "Forgive me," the Viscountess said, baffled, "but whatever is it?" Clara came to stand beside her. She looked at the little brush in its case for a moment, and the smile that crossed her face was one her guest could not read at all: amusement and pain, and something underneath both that made the younger woman feel, obscurely, that she was standing in front of the most valuable object in the house. "That," said the Duchess of Blackwood, "is the first thing my husband ever gave me. I beg your pardon, the asterisk brush. On our wedding night, no less." Clara's eyes danced. "Romantic, isn't he?" The Viscountess laughed uncertainly, sure she was being teased. Clara let her laugh and then said, more gently, looking at the case, "When I first came to this house, my dear, I spent a night on my knees on this floor, and I believed everyone believed that the floor was where I belonged. It took some years and some fires and some people finding their way home before I understood what that brush had actually been trying to teach me." She touched the glass lightly, once, the way one touches an old friend. "It isn't who scrubs the floors of a house that matters. It's who kneels down beside you. Remember that, and you may make a marriage out of anything, even one that begins with a bucket." The Viscountess did not entirely understand, but she remembered it all her life, and repeated it at every wedding she ever attended. That evening, when the visitors were gone, The family dined on the terrace in the long gold light, the Duke and the Duchess, the Earl Lily. The children allowed up scandalously late, and the talk and the laughter carried out over the darkening lawns the way it did every evening now, as if making up arrears. And late that night, as she did sometimes, Clara woke and left her sleeping husband, and walked through the silent house to the nursery, and stood between the two small beds in the moonlight. Around her neck, as always, hung the golden locket, empty now of secrets, its hidden chamber holding nothing any more but a curl of dark baby hair and a curl of gold. She had asked her father, once, whether the old crest inside had truly belonged to his mother's people, and whether the stories about that family were true. Edward Whitfield had smiled the iron smile and said, "One inheritance at a time, little bird," and that for the moment was that. She tucked the wooden horse back under her son's arm where it had fallen. She straightened her daughter's blanket, and she stood a while in the moonlight, the girl who had scrubbed a ballroom in her wedding gown, in the house that was hers, full of the people who were hers, listening to the great manor breathe peacefully around her, keeping everyone she loved under one roof at last. Some stories end with a treasure found, or a villain fallen, or a kingdom won. This one ends with a woman standing in a nursery doorway in the middle of the night, smiling at nothing, wearing an old locket and an older promise, proof, if anyone should ever ask you, that the proudest houses are not built of stone and gold at all, but of second chances, and that love, like truth, may be buried for 18 years. But it does not drown. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.